Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews. I am the Communications Director at EnquireEd, and I am so thrilled to welcome you to our very first webinar of our fall webinar series, The Future of Social Studies. If you have questions anytime during any part of today's webinar, just share them in the chat, and we will make sure to try to address them at the end of the session. Also, on Monday morning, you'll receive an email from me with a link to a blog post that will include a summary of the content we've discussed, including any resources mentioned, and a video recording of the webinar. Feel free to share that out with others. The email will also include a link to request a certificate of attendance if you would like one of those. For those of you just tuning in, thank you so much. Welcome. Chat your questions as they come to you. I mentioned that this was the part of a series, and this series is sponsored by the National Council for the Social Studies and EnquireEd. Now, the National Council for the Social Studies has an exciting opportunity for all of us that care about the social studies, and that is their virtual conference, Solidarity in Social Studies, November 15th to the 21st. You can experience more than 300 plus hours of social studies content to increase your professional learning. All you need to do is go to socialstudies.org/conference to sign up. Founded in 1921, the National Council for the Social Studies is the largest professional association in the country, devoted solely to the social studies education. NCSS engages and supports educators in strengthening and advocating for the social studies. They are a great partner, and we are so glad that they are presenting this webinar series with us. This series is also brought to you by EnquireEd. We have created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum to move students and teachers beyond the textbook, supporting culturally responsive education and inquiry-based teaching and learning. You can find out more about us at EnquireEd.org. I would love to welcome our panelists here today, and we are going to be joined by Lawrence Pasca, Executive Director of NCSS, Natasha Scott, Director of Engagement at iCivics and Facilitator of Professional Learning at EAD, and Shanti Elangovan, Founder and CEO at EnquireEd. And our moderator for today, we're so glad that Sarah Schwartz is going to moderate our discussion today. She's a staff writer for Education Week, and if you haven't read what she's written, go out, Google her name, and read the articles, because she's writing about trends in social studies, trends in education, and always insightfully and well-informed. So I'm so glad to have all of our panelists and our moderator here. I'll invite you now to turn on your cameras and your microphones for us panelists and moderator, and I'm going to hand everything over to you, Sarah, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get a better view of everyone. And I'm going to head over to the chat where I will be moderating. So thank you so much, and take it away, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin. I so appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with Shanti and Larry and Natasha today. So we're in some pretty interesting times for social studies right now. We're seeing over the past couple of years, and especially over since the summer of 2020, a push from educators and students as well to teach a broader account of history that centers long marginalized voices. And at the same time, we're seeing some resistance to that push too, and a public debate over what constitutes the truth about American history, or the true American history. And all of this is taking place, of course, against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic. Over the past school year, 2020-21, we've seen some schools draw back on the amount of time that they've devoted to social studies during virtual learning in order to prioritize live instruction for English and math. And now we're entering another school year that's already in many places been disrupted by COVID-19. And so the question kind of is, where do social studies educators go from here? How can they cut through some of the vitriol in the public conversation about their subject? In some cases, increase scrutiny on their practice, and provide thoughtful and thorough and challenging instruction for the students that they serve. And how can schools make sure that social studies doesn't kind of get lost in the shuffle as they continue to juggle all of the different priorities that come with pandemic era schooling? So these are some of the questions and kind of broad themes that I hope we're able to address today. And I want to start with some of these laws on divisive concepts on critical race theory that we're seeing surface in state houses right now. So far, 27 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that would limit how teachers can discuss racism and, in some cases, sexism and gender identity in the classroom. 12 states have enacted these bans, either through legislation or other avenues like State Department of Education rules. And I know I've already been talking for a little while, but before I start with a question, I do kind of want to give a little bit of background about where these laws came from, how we got here, just because I think that can be helpful so everyone's sort of on the same page as we start our conversation. And I kind of think that in order to understand this, we have to go back to May 2020 and the summer of 2020, when after the murder of George Floyd, many schools and teachers were putting a renewed focus on teaching about racism and systemic inequity in American society. And there, as that happened, that sparked a backlash, a response from conservative pundits, but also parents and communities, in some cases across the political spectrum, who argued that social studies lessons were putting too much emphasis on the negative aspects of US history, and that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were causing division between students from different racial backgrounds. And so these laws and these state level actions that we're seeing are kind of an outgrowth of this response. And educators, a lot of educators say teaching about history, teaching about historical inequities, present day inequities is meant to give students a fuller, more accurate picture of American society and prepare them for civic life. On the other, sort of on the other perspective of this, authors of these bills have interpreted schools' efforts as an attempt to guilt and blame white students. And that's why these laws ban things like saying that one race is better than another, or saying that all white people are responsible for the actions of other white people in the past. And teachers say that they don't, a lot of teachers will say they don't teach these ideas. They're not in the classroom saying one race is better than another race. But the concern in the education community is about interpretation of these laws, and that they can be interpreted broadly and subjectively in some cases, and might curtail important lessons about the nation's past and about its civic present. Okay, so now that I've sort of gone through all of that, here's the question. Now that we have these laws and state level actions in 12 states, what should schools and educators expect to see happen practically, and what should they be preparing for? Is there anything that's going to substantively change when it comes to how schools are able to design and implement social studies instruction? And so maybe we'll start with Larry, and then Natasha, and then Shanti.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you again for moderating today. And again, Natasha, Shanti, appreciate very much the partnership, both Civics EAD and Inquire Ed. Essentially, in some ways, it may actually be a little early to tell. Right now, if you're seeing in the news, there are stories, sadly, almost every day, of teachers who may be concerned, school boards that are announcing their review of curricula, reading in some media about principals that may be, whose jobs are on the line right now for their positions on how they're framing instruction in their school. Some states are revising standards or planning to or already have. We have to remember that learning standards ultimately drive curriculum, they drive instruction, assessment, and professional development. Probably the first place you're going to see things happen is at the school board level. So school board elections coming up this year, going into next year, maybe the first avenue at the local level where kind of this tension around this notion of divisive concepts comes into play. I'm wondering if in the curriculum publishing world that may be a later avenue. And the reason I say that is a lot of times it takes a year or longer to develop, edit, publish curriculum materials. Meanwhile, many educators go online or they're using materials that have already been developed. Many educators are finding ways to use instructional materials without a traditional textbook. So, you know, again, I think in a lot of ways it's still kind of happening. We were tracking a lot of these bills coming up over the summer, and that was a time when school was not in session. So in many ways, it gave an opportunity for educators really to just kind of pause, focus on their curriculum planning, their lesson planning for the next year, coming back into school where many places schools weren't open or they weren't open fully. And so that was an additional tension. But I would say just looking forward, you know, we're tracking this issue at more of a school board level. And then obviously the impact on curricular resources would likely come after that.
Yeah, and I think I just add, you know, as we acknowledge that all of these bills are and laws are being passed, that there are states that are actually they're actually shifting and they're actually expanding education on racism and bias and contributions of marginalized populations. So there's also states that are actually pushing the envelope that way too. So I think that's important for us to just pay attention to as well. And I think, as Larry pointed out, there's the short term and there's the long term. You know, I think the long term, we're still waiting to see how everything continues to play out. But in the short term, understanding that, I think one thing I just really want to reinforce for educators is you're not alone. Talk to your teacher, talk to your colleagues, talk to your school leaders, have those conversations so that you can figure out what your plan is together as a community. And in reality, we're in the business of teaching, right? We have to teach. Court cases are going to continue to go on, but class has to go on. And we want educators empowered to teach, and we want them not having to deal with these legal arguments all the time in the classroom, but just being aware of what's happening and understanding that there's still so much that can be done within those guidelines as well.
Yeah, I really agree with my peers here and say, just kind of add on. I think, Sarah, you did a really great job of really kind of breaking down where this came from. And I kind of want to hone in on one point, which is really the idea that did it start in school boards and in classrooms, or did it start with pundits who were looking for a clickbait? And I believe pretty strongly it started with clickbait. Is okay, we can grab onto this idea and then that's how we're going to get people going. And then we saw it come down to school board meetings and coming down into schools and into classrooms and into teachers and students' lives. And so I think, again, we've got to ask ourselves that same idea right now as we talk about, we're seeing more and more of news media coming out with ideas of what's happening in the classroom for teachers. And it's really important. I don't envy the position that reporters like you are in, Sarah, because you have to balance, we got to report on what's happening, but on the other hand, are we putting so much attention on something, then it becomes the thing that happens, if that makes sense. And so there's a chicken or the egg situation here that I think we all have to acknowledge here. And really saying, like Natasha said, there are some really great things happening out there, that this isn't everything, but it is taking up all of the space. And the truth of the matter is, social studies has been marginalized for a long time. I joked with Sarah before this panel started today, thanks for covering social studies, because honestly, we haven't gotten the love. And now all of a sudden people want to come in and say what it is for people that hadn't paid any attention. And along with that, we've left teachers completely out there on their own. We have not given them instructional materials. We've given them outdated textbooks that have been sitting on shelves for 20 years, if we've given them anything. And so it's a long overlooked subject. And now to come in and jump on teachers and say, you're doing something wrong. We all got to really ask ourselves, how are we supporting teachers in the classroom in this moment, in the work that they're trying to do?
There are a couple things that that you all said that I wanted to follow up on a little bit. So Shanti and Natasha both mentioned some of the the laws and other actions happening in other places, other states that are expanding the curriculum, expanding the lists of events, people, ideas that students should be learning about. And I'm wondering if either of you or if Larry can talk a little bit about one or two of those, what's going on in that space.
Tasha, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think I can just talk about my home state of Massachusetts over here. It was just recently, I would say, I think last Monday, there was all sorts of legislative hearings. I think right now there were so many legislative hearings on the docket to have conversations about Indigenous studies, to have conversations about ethnic studies, to have conversations about all of these different topics that teachers and the community are really passionate about. And so we see those coming to the surface that the community wants to talk and engage in these issues. And that's a great thing, right? Thinking about how are we incorporating everyone's story into our shared narrative of our history.
Yeah, I'll share too, just, moving, just kind of putting CRT aside for a second, you highlighted this in terms of COVID. We have a district partner in Detroit Public Schools, and I was speaking with them, they put an RFP out for curricular materials right as COVID, we all had no idea what was going on. I think it was in May of last year. And I'll be honest, I was surprised that they did it. I thought, oh, most people are pulling back and they're saying, no, we can't do this. And I was speaking with their curriculum director there and asking, why'd you do this? I'm glad you chose us. I'm really glad it's worked out for us. We're happy about it, but why? I imagine there's a lot going on right now. Social studies was always at the low. Now, now what? She said, if not now, when? And I think that's something that we've all got to think about. What are we all grappling with right now in our world? What are our students grappling with? If this isn't about social studies, I don't know what is. And so really the space and time to really for students, for us to grapple with the world that they live in, with their lived experiences, they are living in history, and the opportunity to understand how we're critical of those moments and how we understand those moments and dissect those moments is, I think, more crucial than ever.
This is a conversation I keep having with teachers this year where, we'll talk about how we are living through such a unique historical moment, and there's so much to pull from that's happening in the news to talk about in a social studies classroom, history of science, the last year, the election, like everything that's going on. And at the same time, going back to something I said as I was at the top of this hour is, in some schools, the pandemic has forced some curriculum choices that in some cases is putting social studies on the back burner a little bit. I know, Shanti, you were talking about that school that wasn't necessarily making that choice, but I'm wondering for schools that are feeling that kind of pressure right now, how do we keep a focus on social studies? What's the pandemic's effect on the discipline been, and how do we address that? And whoever wants to go ahead and take that first can do that.
Well, I could start just by saying, I think we're all tracking our worry right now that the effect of the pandemic has been to just further exacerbate inequities all around. I love the examples that were given earlier, because just as we were starting to see some pockets and glimmers of hope, and then what we see is this massive shifting overnight. And I can't stress this enough, how humble I feel to think about. I don't know of many other industries, maybe any other industry, where literally on Friday, March 13th, 2020, everybody went home from a face-to-face brick and mortar setting, and then 2 days later picked up completely online. And a lot of students were unfortunately unable to access directly. A lot of teachers didn't have the supports to take an entire industry and move it online literally over a weekend. Creates obviously a breeding ground of a lot of inequity, but then compounded by the fact that we were already seeing a lot of challenges to the instructional time for social studies, right? And that's elementary predominantly, but K-12 all over. Our worry about that is that now that the system's kind of moved back online, during that past year, as you pointed out, so many things have happened where we've all said to ourselves, if this, if the challenges to our institutions, to our democracy, many of the issues for justice and equity that we're calling for, if these aren't reasons why we need social studies education, what other reasons would we need them for? Kids need to unpack these issues. They need space and time to do so. And one of the things we talked about pre-COVID was we're trying to carve out time for social studies in the school day. You don't carve out time for social studies. You start with social studies. You lead with social studies. And the pandemic, I hope, has shown that, but I don't think it has, because what we do see is that we're prioritizing ELA and math. We don't have time for anything else. But this is a subject that is fundamental to a well-rounded education. It starts with social studies. And the reason it starts with social studies is because inquiry is the heart. Studying humanity, what makes us human, what makes us people. That is fundamentally what every child asks about. That's what they want to know about. What's my role in the world? How do I live in this world? And especially at a time when children are saying, I've been disconnected from my peers, from my teachers, my family. This is the moment where kids are asking, what does this mean for me? And that's where social studies rises to the challenge of answering those questions and helping kids find those answers. But I'm very concerned that we've moved from carving out to further carving out. And what we really need to be saying is, no, how do we start with, how do we lead with, not how do we continue to carve out?
Exactly. I'll jump in here too, thinking about when we think about the carving of time and siloing subjects. I think what ends up happening is the chunk gets tinier and tinier and tinier, right? And if we think about how, I think especially at the elementary level, I put on my elementary educator hat, right? Used to be a third grade teacher. And I think with that third grade teacher hat, there's this concept of, well, how can we actually think creatively as well? How can we think about the integration and the connection that we see across the subjects? Okay, if we think about even just your classroom environment and the space that you're creating, that is civics right there. That is civics. That is thinking about how your community is working together. That is a foundation, right? And thinking about how do we constantly come back to that? How do we think about how can we incorporate some of our founding documents into our literature conversations? Okay, it doesn't have to be separated. Thinking about the connections that we can make, and actually students will grab onto it and they love it. They love the content. They love the conversations. And I think it's also shifting this mindset. I feel like there's this stuck mindset when we think about civics and history and social studies, that there's a sage on the stage and that it's this just stand, lecture, and deliver. And when you do really good social studies, it's not that at all. You have the engagement, you have students who are buying in, you have students who want to learn and learn about their community and learn about their past.
And I'll just add one more point to, I think research can also be a friend here. There's, quite a bit of research showing that if we want students to improve their literacy skills, if that's what the world is saying that matters, I would disagree with that, but if that's what the world wants to say matters, actually, you can't do that without teaching social studies. You need content, and students need to build background knowledge and all of these things. And so I think leaning into some of these places as well is an important point. And I think Larry kind of hit on this, and both Larry and Natasha hit on this, is where are we entering the content from? So sometimes we talk about content-based literacy, so using literacy as the entry point for content. But I actually think we need to turn that on its head and really think about content as the entry point for these other subject areas, because a lot of the research is saying, hey, the students need to build this deep background knowledge, and that deep background knowledge won't happen if we're jumping from subject to subject to subject and for topic to topic to topic, that we've got to go deep. The students really need to build that so that they can get to those higher level literacy skills that we want them to get to.
Yeah, building off of that, Shanti, I'm seeing some super interesting conversation in the chat about this. And I wanted to bring up some of the points that are in here about this integration topic. And so I'm seeing some people say that, integrating social studies into English language arts can sometimes mean that there is kind of like a shallow exploration of the social studies content, and that it's really just using, it's using historical content to do English language arts skills without as much historical thinking. Yeah. But then, other people are saying, while that might be true, integrating subjects is still really important, and it can, you can do some really great things with that. So how do we balance that? And if there are any examples of places that that are doing this really well, if you could share those as well.
Yeah. Oh, Natasha, you look like you're about to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking something that immediately comes to mind when I hear that kind of conversation, that challenge posed. I think about that for the most basic read aloud that we see in the elementary classroom, right? We have the read aloud, and it could be a social studies text, and you're like, great, it's a topic, it's social studies. But if you don't ever get to those deeper questions that get to those deeper conversations, that's where you're shifting from just scratching the surface of social studies and keeping it very shallow and actually shifting it to be a deeper conversation. And I think that's exactly what we need to make sure that we're doing for something as basic as a read aloud. How are we shifting our questions so that they're actually getting to the deeper topics and deeper conversation points that align with history and civics conversations?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of really think about what Natasha's talking about is really a skill, and also really goes into curriculum design. And so again, I think I'll circle back to what I originally started with, that elementary, especially elementary social studies teachers, but social studies teachers in general have really been left to figure it out on their own, that instructional materials have just been left completely stagnant. And, while ELA is like a $20 billion business, I think, social studies has some meager, like, 2 billion or something comparatively. And so the market size hasn't wanted publishers to go out. Like, let's just be honest about why they're not doing it. They're not changing their content because the money's not there. And so we really have to really think about, how do we design materials that are supporting teachers in doing this? Because exactly like folks are saying in the chat, being able to integrate these things is not easy. It's already challenging to have third graders in front of you and think about what you're doing in ELA. It's already challenging to think about how you're building background knowledge and developing these skills in social studies. And then trying to think about, like, am I doing these things at the same time? Like, well, that's a lot. That really takes a really intentional design, from the lesson level to the unit level to the year level to vertical integration of skills over the years. And so I will say that I really believe, as a social studies industry, we've got to really think about how we improve instructional materials, and really think about how we support teachers with those instructional materials, both from ELA social studies skill set, but also even just moving back to CRT, right? So if we just say, hey, teachers, go figure it out in the classroom, we're leaving them to be responsible when somebody comes in and says, why are you teaching that? But if the district has gone through a board approval of saying, hey, we approved these instructional materials, we really vetted them, we've gone through it, we've really thought about what we have, it really changes the dynamic for teachers to feel that safety and that brave space to be able to say, I'm going to go in, I'm doing this. This is what I'm supposed to be teaching, so I'm going to do this, rather than just saying, hey, I'm just hanging out here, I got to go figure it out all on my own, and then it's my fault when it goes wrong.
And I want to add one quick thing to that, which is, okay, so most young children are constantly told to pick up the trash, pick up the shoes on the floor, pick up the bags, whatever. So why not frame a material? So I'll give you a real world example. Recently, I was looking at a homework assignment on multiple perspectives, and I'm just thinking about what a great question would be, instead of some activity about, Johnny said this and Billy said this, and what does that mean? And then what are the perspectives about? Instead, flip it and say, part of a social studies curriculum at the elementary level is to understand, what are the services provided in my community? What are my rights and responsibilities as a community member? So how about a question of, who's responsible for picking up the trash in my community? Well, to a second or third grader who's always told, pick up the trash, pick up after yourself, that's an interesting question. Wait, there's a responsibility to clean up around me outside of my house? Wouldn't our curriculum materials address the question that way? It doesn't require deep content expertise. It just requires shifting the question from an activity or a frame that's just based on reading something that doesn't have any context or meaning to me as a learner, to something that is a direct question that I, as a young learner, am asking all the time. I want to pick up after myself. What do you mean I have to? Oh, wait, we actually pay taxes for trash collection to come? Again, right away, you're getting kids to think, you're getting them to think about civics, you're getting them to think about social studies, and you're also teaching them the critical skills. So for us, it's really, how do you just shift the focus to get away from the skill to the skill anchored in meaningful content and questions that kids really care about?
I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk some about the roadmap to educating for American democracy. So I can give a little background for people in the virtual audience who might not be familiar, and then I'll invite the panelists to also give background as they talk about it, whatever I'm leaving out. So the roadmap is a set of history and civics guidelines released in March of this year that was developed by a national panel of dozens of academics, educators, civic nonprofit leaders. It's not content neutral, so it does include specific ideas and events and people that students should learn about, but it's not a list of names and dates. It's more oriented around kind of guiding conceptual questions that students and teachers can explore together. And when I was reading it and writing about it, the kind of main idea that stood out to me was this idea of reflective patriotism, this attempt to walk a middle path between this a fierce critique of the United States and unbridled admiration of the United States. And so I'm curious about sort of what is the way forward for a framework like this in the kind of polarized climate that we're living in right now. And I'm wondering, Natasha, if you want to kick us off on that one.
Sure, I get to talk about EAD all the time. I love the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. So I'm happy to kick us off. And I think when we think about the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, we call it the EAD roadmap, it's really thinking about how are we incorporating those multiple perspectives constantly, and this history that really inspires this concept of reflective patriotism. And when we think about reflective patriotism, it's kind of that situation where it's a both and, right? Getting the opportunity to shift away from that zero-sum game that, that results in the polarization that we're seeing now in our society, but really getting us a chance to both celebrate US history and the positive moments that we see and those triumphs, but also acknowledging that there are times when we've fallen short of our country's ideals. Okay, and thinking about how are we getting the opportunity to reflect on both those triumphs and those tensions, and then figuring out together how do we find a path forward. And so I think one of the other base foundational pieces of the EAD roadmap is this concept of inquiry. Really thinking about how are we weaving those conversations of history and civics and how together, and how are we inspiring students to really dive deeper into these points of tension that we see. Rather than, I think, oftentimes in the classroom, what we see is we kind of, we're going to avoid it, we're going to step aside, we're going to move away from it. But really, what the roadmap is calling us to do is to lean into it, have those conversations, have those inquiries, engage in the content, and really understand that this is where we're going to explore information, discuss those difficult questions, and actually seek answers built with facts in those conversations as well.
What you mentioned about teaching the teaching the controversy and stepping into the points of contention. That's what social studies teachers who I talk to always say is like, that's best practice. That's what you should do. I think that's becoming harder and harder for people to feel comfortable doing. They worry about getting reprimanded by administration, hearing from parents or family members. And I know we talked a little bit about, how school administration and district administrations can sort of come together to put forth a united front on some of these questions. But how can teachers go forward with this best practice, either implementing the roadmap or not using it, doing what they've always been doing? How do they do that in this kind of environment? And I mean, Natasha, you can take that, or if anyone else wants to take that as well.
Yeah, I think one of the pieces that I just love to surface with that is understanding that when you're diving into these questions and these inquiries, you're not going in assuming that there's a right and a wrong answer, right? What you're actually doing is encouraging students to think for themselves. And I think that's where some of that tension arises when we assume there's a right answer. We try to encourage thinking one way or another, but rather as we're shifting and we're actually teaching those critical thinking skills and how to think about how to think about our history and the present, I think that's where we can really lean into the students and their lived experiences, so that we can kind of take that tension away of saying, well, there's this right answer, this is the only right answer, but after actually shifting that mindset.
I want to build on what you just said, Natasha. Again, we at NCSS, we support the roadmap really as a wonderful extension of inquiry and our own C3 framework. And I thought a lot about this phrase, reflective patriotism, and I thought you said it so well. Patriotism itself is a tough word, right? Because it sounds like it's love of country, but then you think about reflection. Reflection is about thought. We are teaching kids to not only just be proud of themselves, but proud of where they are, where they live in the world, what they can contribute to the world. I mean, all of that those are dimensions of patriotism. The reflective piece comes in the human desire. Again, I keep going back to, we are the study of humanity, and all that's good and warts and all about us, right? But one of the things about humanity is we want to solve problems. If I'm hungry, I want to know where I'm going to eat. If I'm bored, I want something to do. If I'm traveling, I want to know how I'm going to get there. We're constantly solving problems. Our brains are just wired to figure things out all the time. So what the roadmap, what the C3 framework, what social studies and inquiry is all about is just saying there are questions in this world. You are one that can answer them. You are also part of communities that can answer them. Sometimes answers are good, sometimes they're not good, sometimes they're incomplete. What is your role in all of this? And we can't stress that enough, that I think if we can help shift this conversation of social studies, of a place where battlegrounds are to be fought and people are to be marginalized and voices are to be silenced, that's not the social studies classroom we know. If that happens in a social studies classroom, is it because the resources weren't there? Is it because the training wasn't there? Is it because the time wasn't there? It's not because a professional walks into a classroom and says, how today can I help kids feel less than themselves? That's a narrative that we just need to push against together. Everyone here needs to say what a teacher does best and what kids do best in a social studies classroom is ask questions and find answers within themselves and using materials. But I love what you said about this notion of inquiry and reflection, and the fact that this is all about how you structure questions and inquiry and get yourself in the mindset of knowing the world is all about things you ask, answer, and are empowered to solve, both individually and collectively.
I'll just add to that in terms of kind of coming from the perspective of being on the curricular side of it. I think that what we've seen here with starting with C3 is a real foundation to say, hey, this is what social studies looks like. It's an inquiry-based framework, and we really want to move social studies rather than to this idea of just filling you with facts and really starting with questions, always moving through sustained investigation, and students really building deep background knowledge as they're going through that work and then drawing their own conclusions. And so then we saw EAD really add another layer to that, to really think about what are the questions that we're asking? What does it look like to ask those questions? How do we frame this in a classroom? Because asking good questions is actually very, very challenging. We use something in our curriculum called the question formulation technique, and that the folks at the Right Question Institute developed, and we love, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with. And sometimes when teachers first use it, they'll say, oh, my students don't know how to ask questions, or this didn't go very well. And it's like, yeah, because even as adults, we all don't know how to phrase these questions. How do we phrase them as open-ended? How do we not lead students to the conclusion? How do we not try to put questions there where it's already a settled issue and we're asking a question that really shouldn't be a question? So those kinds of things can be really challenging to do. Now it's time to go a little further, though, I believe really strongly, is that we've got these, what I believe are really giving us a menu of what we want this to look like in the classroom, but we haven't gotten down to the specificity of recipe cards for teachers. And so now we've got this really great foundation and consensus around inquiry. We know what it looks like to phrase questions and really thinking about some of the content around this. And now we've got to go further, and we've got to say, here's how you design instructional materials that actually look like that and support teachers with that. because this is not easy work. Trying to design inquiries while also thinking about the specific needs of each of the students in the classroom is very challenging. We've got to ask ourselves, where should the teacher focus? How can that teacher take something that's already has a lot of that, and then really think about the lived experiences of the students sitting in front of them, and think about how they bring that inquiry to life in their classroom.
So where are we right now with the development of curricular materials that are aligned to this roadmap? Do we what kind of progress have we made on that so far? And then also, do we have any examples of schools or teachers using the roadmap in some interesting ways?
So I think I'd start with acknowledging that part of the work with EAD, one of the things that I first want to bring to the surface is I love that we also need to acknowledge as K-12, that it's really starting with our youngest learners, because we have to start there and getting to our high schoolers, the elementary educator, and we had to acknowledge that. But I think the other piece that has been part of this process with the development of the roadmap is actually the curation of resources as well. So on our Educating for American Democracy roadmap, what we've been doing is we've been collaborating with organizations across the country and having them on one hand submit resources, curating resources, and just starting to bring that collection together, because there's a lot of places where we see that work. And as the educator, we know how hard it is to go and find those resources. That takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of to find, to vet, to see if it aligns to your standards. So with some of the resources that you see on the Educating for American Democracy website in the teacher resource section, you're seeing resources that are aligned to the themes and to the supporting and sample guiding, to the driving and sample guiding questions, and which is a great start, right? Because there's lots out there. So that's just starting and beginning to scratch the surface there.
Yeah, I'll add in kind of thinking about where we are. I think we have to acknowledge one of the real challenges that's in social studies, where we've seen Common Core kind of set a national set of standards across ELA. We've seen in math, we've seen NGSS really been used across. And in social studies, it's very hard to come up with national standards. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're seeing actually the move away from that. And so while other subject areas have really, because they've been able to use that national set of standards to use organizations like EdReports to actually review materials and say, okay, here's where the standard is this hitting this? We have a bit of a challenge in social studies that's really to say, what do high quality instructional materials look like if we don't have a specific bar? And so I think we've got to be a little creative in social studies about how we're thinking about this. Can we think about a landscape analysis of the standards that we see in common across states? Can we think about where inquiry, where we have what the things we have in common, like inquiry? Over 35 states have revamped their standards. Really thinking about inquiry at the center of that. So are there ways to think about how we think these materials get designed based off of where we are with social studies, rather than saying, well, we don't have national standards in social studies, it's not going to happen. So I think we can be creative in social studies, and that we've got the ingredients. I think the C3 framework and EAD really have given it to us. They've said, like, here's what this needs to look like. And I think that next step is going a little further, like Natasha said, and we've got some really great resources out there, but going even further into pushing publishers to really think about the kinds of materials that they're putting out there.
I can throw one quick thing out there to balance off what you just said, Shanti. I would also encourage, right now, there are reports like Fordham's recent release of the state of standards in civics and history, the roadmap, obviously all these other great resources that are out there. The focus does tend to focus on history and civics directly. Social studies is, I always call it the original STEM, because STEM learning is all about science, math, technology all together. Social studies 100 years ago brought together multiple disciplines that did share some common foundations together in this discipline of social studies. But social studies is geography, it is economics, it's sociology, it's psychology, it's the study of religion, the rule of law. I always leave some out. I never mean to offend any individual disciplines when I do. But that's part of the challenge for social studies, is when we ask inquiry questions, we're not just looking at it from one lens, not just the historical lens or the civic lens or the geographic lens. some of my favorite inquiry questions, even the question I posed earlier of who really is responsible for picking up the trash. I mean, there's economics, every discipline is affected. That also, I hope, empowers not just teachers, but also school systems to say, I'm stretched for time, I'm stressed. Good news, though, is social studies does impact all of my subject areas. These are questions that should also be part of, now notice I say should also be, meaning it's asked in a social studies context, but these are questions that influence my math instruction. These can be questions that show up in a science room, in English language learning, and other subjects. We do want to give attention to that, though, and I just always have to defend that notion that we think social studies, make sure that we do think as broadly as possible and that we're as inclusive, not just of multiple perspectives, but of multiple disciplines that do all inform those questions we ask in the subject.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important point, especially as I feel like now the public focus and the focus of a lot of this conversation too has been on history and civics, and that's kind of like what's hot right now. But that social studies is really a huge discipline, and an interdisciplinary study as well. Yeah. I want to ask one more question before we go to questions from the audience, and it goes back to one thing that you said, Shanti, where you said we don't have national social studies standards, we don't have national history standards, and we're probably not going to. And I think, you know, from my understanding of you know the history of this, part of that has to do with controversy, and that it's you know it's kind of too hard to agree nationally on what we think those standards should comprise. And so I'm wondering if, you know, if any of you think that sentiment is going to affect uptake of the roadmap at all, or if the roadmap is different than you know, a set of national standards, and in what way?
Natasha, you want to jump in?
Yep,
Yeah,
I'll jump in. Sorry about that.
no worries.
I think that one of the pieces that's a little bit different about the roadmap is that it allows, it was designed for flexibility, right? It's designed to for flexibility. So states can look at the roadmap and use the roadmap and build the connections with their own state standards. I think that is something that's a little bit different. So that way, we know that every state has completely different standards right now. We know that every teacher is trying to meet those standards within their state. And so here, where states have the opportunity to draw those connections with the themes and with the design challenges that they see in the roadmap, really that gives them the space to deepen the learning that's happening directly with their standards. I think that's a little bit different, right? That flexibility that we don't always see.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to acknowledge too that I agree, Sarah, that we don't have national standards in social studies because it is because of controversy, because of differing opinions about what content matters and whose knowledge matters and things like that. But I think there's also something inherently local about social studies that we need to acknowledge that is different than any other subject area. That local context, local community, all the way down to the community level, like the micro community, like your neighborhood, your city, all of those things, to your state, to your region. Some of those things really come out to play in social studies. And so there's tension when you start to think about the content that students are learning about. We do want teachers to think about the very specific context they're in. And I think that's a challenge as curriculum designers at InquireEd, we think about that all the time. How do we frame inquiries in a way that allow teachers to have enough here to really understand what this inquiry is, and that we're giving them sources, that we're giving them the learning experience designer on those sources, but there's space to bring in that lived and historical experience of the students in their classroom. And so it really goes into that context of community and bringing that into the space. And when we talk about moving into informed action, community is where that is. You know, what does it look like to take action? Well, it really depends on what community you're in and what your students think makes sense for their community, and their community might be their classroom. And so there's so many different things there that I do think we need to acknowledge in social studies that make something like an idea of national standards very complex and compared to some of the other subject areas.
Yeah, that reminds me of what, Larry, you were saying about who who picks up the trash in your community, who, you know, is in charge of municipal services. That's a question that is in some ways universal, but the answer is going to be really local. So
I'm, you know, it's always concerning when it feels like every, you know, either municipality or state or has to start from scratch. They have to start with their own. They're not cross-referencing. Some states have what are acknowledged as outstanding standards. Others could learn from that when they're revising their own. We're proud that many states have chosen to adopt or adapt the C3 framework. Obviously, the roadmap and Inquire Ed resources align with that spirit of inquiry. And yeah, it is local, and yet kids ask the same fundamental questions. Whether you're in Alaska or Maine right now, I guarantee you many of your kids are going home today asking, is climate change something I need to worry about? My own third graders the other day, true story, asked the question, what's the bigger problem, COVID or climate change? They're worried. Wow, mind blown. But you know what? I guarantee you, kids are asking the same question. They want the outlet of where they can answer that. And I would love us to not focus so much on making a laundry list of every piece of content we need to know for the test, and instead focus on ask questions. They probably ask universal questions. And yet you're absolutely right. It's that local context where they come alive because they start at their home and start their community. Love to see us talk about that because I agree with you. I'd love us to have a more national framework for standards, but for now we have an framework. It's supported in multiple places like your organizations, and that can be the launching point for so many states and districts to have wonderful, wonderful conversations together about how they're going to provide a social education.
Agreed.
I would just chime in too, Larry, that I think that also creates an opportunity for states to have conversations. So you have your local community, you have the network of organizations that can support educators with finding resources, with digging into different topics that are very local to their context. I think thinking about how we leverage that opportunity for organizations to come together and say, you know, how can we help teachers? How can we come together? How can we either think about what resources we have that teachers can engage with and use in the classroom to deepen their inquiries, whether it's data on the local water usage, whatever it may be, thinking about how we kind of come together as a community to help support our teachers that way, because we know then our students can have access to just people who they can have conversations with and talk to and do interviews with.
Well, I'm going to move on to some of the questions that Martin has sent me through the chat. Before I do, I just want to say thank you for this great conversation. Shanti, Larry, and Natasha, I really appreciated being able to speak with you. So the first question here is, panelists, can you help me with a suggestion for a graceful response to parents who say, my child is too young to learn about these issues, when they want to keep perceived progressive topics out of our global studies classroom? And the question asker here specified that the students in their class are 11 or 12.
I want to acknowledge first, so we really have focused in on the elementary space, and I'm a former elementary teacher, and it sounds like Natasha is as well, so I'm sure she'll have something to say about this. So I want to first acknowledge that I think we've got to acknowledge the parents' concern here. So this isn't easy, actually. So deciding what is age appropriate, I think, is a very challenging thing. We have these conversations all the time. We had learning experience designers on our team presenting the other day about source selection in a unit really looking deeply at slavery. And so what are we looking at is kind of really thinking about in like, is this source, like how far are we going here? These aren't easy things to make choices about. And I think we've got to acknowledge that from that parent, first of all. I think we've got to also say this is history. And if we want to think about developing criticality in our students, which I think is an incredibly important thing, skill set, to really understand where we've come from and where we're going, we've got to be honest about what these things look like. And so, but that, you know, it is a gray area to say where this is and what's appropriate. So I think it's important to really engage in conversations and to not just jump. I think when I see that question, and I was asked these things when I was a fifth grade teacher, is, whoa, what are you doing? I think immediately I wanted to be like, no, I'm teaching your students about history. Like, what's wrong with that? Like, I'm telling, like, giving it to them as it is. And some students are having to live this in their everyday life from the time that they're born. And you're worried that your student is having to encounter it when they're 11 years old. But I do think we have to kind of almost come into it with grace and say, let me talk to me about your concerns. What are you concerned about here? What are you concerned that where this conversation is going and where you're worried this is? And let's unpack what we're actually doing in the classroom. Let's unpack how I actually selected this source and what's happening in this source and why we've chosen this source as part of a larger inquiry to really build this knowledge of students. So I really think conversations are important when we're dealing with this, and not just jump into, hey, this isn't, we don't want to talk about this kind of thing.
Exactly. Shanti, I think acknowledging, like you said, that conversation, that relationship with parents, taking the time, have a conversation with them, see what their concerns are, just to reiterate what Shanti was already saying. And you can see if a parent is concerned about it could be the content they're concerned about. Maybe they're concerned about the pedagogical strategies that are being used in the classroom to teach the content. And that's where you as a teacher can reassure them and say, great, this is what the content, as Shanti said, is actually talking about. And this is the way we're going to engage with it. I'm not just handing some gruesome images over to your child to go investigate by themselves, but rather, we're going to have a conversation about resources that are developmentally appropriate, and we're going to engage and do it together.
I would also throw one quick thought out there too. I do love inquiry questions where, whether you're in 3rd grade or 12th grade, there's a way to answer them. And obviously, as you go more in depth, some kids may be ready to answer an inquiry question like, does where you live matter, with specific details or context about how the pandemic's affected them. And perhaps those kids, it's a comfortable space for them. The teacher can work with them on that. For other kids, they may not be there yet. Or again, sometimes if you lead with a question that enables that interpretation, that enables students to draw multiple perspectives and based, because again, part of what makes a great classroom, and I know you two come from the elementary perspective. I have elementary kids at home. I was a middle school teacher. So we're all kind of thinking in the younger learner space, but there are ways to do it without it necessarily being something that's just kind of a blunt instrument in the classroom. At the same time, if the class itself or group of kids are starting to bring that topic in and they're bringing that content in as their way of answering, that also tells you they may be ready for diving a little bit deeper. It's a great question. It's a hard question.
And there's another note here along similar lines to what all of you were saying. This is the question. I often wonder if taking parents or legislators through the inquiry process would be helpful. And that kind of echoes what some of you were saying about really explaining the pedagogical approach. Here's how we're using that resource. Here's what we're going to do. We have another question here that is specifically related to COVID. So the question is, this is also a good time to help students explore what a democratic society is. What is common good? How do we balance our rights and responsibilities within society? Does that change in a time of crisis such as COVID? And I'm wondering if you could share any, this is me, not the question. Wondering if you could share any examples of, how teachers can talk about the civic and social implications of COVID in the classroom, what that could look like. Maybe Larry, if you want to take that, and then Natasha and Shanti.
Hate myself a little bit, with a piece of chalk about 20 years ago, I would draw a line on the floor in my classroom and just say, we're going to look at where one's rights end and others begin, and what that line looks like. You can still do that today if you have chalk or not, just don't use permanent marker, but really it is a fundamental question. It's not a COVID question. That's what also I hope for those of you that are worried, how do I talk about this with my kids, or I just want to be careful in my community. It can lead to a discussion about COVID, but this is what I love about social studies. It's a fundamental question. Where do my rights end and another's begin? Is there an end? And in a case like, what does it mean to have a common good? Again, when you lead from these questions that they're not bland, they're not neutral, they're not boring, they're actually, they make you think, but then you can apply them in those contexts. And I might recommend starting from there versus let's start with the question about COVID, because that could scare or more uncomfortable. And I would, to your point earlier about, just walking parents through or community members through, I would say to the extent that you can, I know many of you right now are in schools where you can't just have open visitors or parents are not allowed in, but any chance you get to show the good work you do, because you know your classroom best. Many of you have been doing this for years. At the end of the day, a social studies classroom is a place of inquiry. It is a place where learning is very active and vibrant. And to the extent we can show that, and we can show this is really what happens in our classrooms, these are examples of what we think and talk about, I think the more we can bring the temperature down a little bit, because I would challenge some people that are probably the most upset right now, just haven't seen your classroom. They haven't been in this space. They haven't seen Natasha's or Shanti's materials and just seen, oh, this is what teachers are working from.
Exactly. I feel like every time it was back to school night in my classroom, it was, let's actually do some of the activities. Like, this is what we should actually engage in. This is what your students do. This is what your kids do every day. And I think, and one other place that I would just kind of lean back into as well is, as you're diving into some of those questions, if you're trying to figure out how to scaffold questions to get to that deeper understanding of the common good, going back, I would say definitely go poke around the roadmap. The roadmap has just those kinds of questions that can help deepen the conversation about those rights and responsibilities, and just thinking about how our actions and choices, both for ourselves and our communities and our country, and how they're all intertwined. So if you're looking for a place to kind of keep scaffolding some of those questions, I'd go poke around the roadmap. I think that'll definitely give you some more. We can always use more questions.
I think my colleague said it well. I think, Larry, you really, in that idea of entering in, where are we entering from? And are we learning history because we want to know a bunch of dates and facts? Or are we learning history to really think about where we are in a modern day context? And somebody said this: history alone is not sufficient to engage students to become informed and active citizens. We've got to relate everything that we're doing to modern day context. And I promise, if you ask the questions like Larry's talking about, your students will go there without you needing to put anything about COVID on the board. And so, yeah, I think students are doing that all the time and drawing those connections.
Well, we're right at 5:30, so I'm gonna stop talking before I get in trouble. Yeah, I mean, thank you all so much. It was such a pleasure to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
And just everyone who attended, all of our participants, thank you. I am going to send out an email on Monday with a link to a blog post. It will have any resources that panelists mentioned, as well as a recording of the webinar, which you can share with others. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you.